Lena sat at the edge of her bed, the moonlight spilling through the cracked blinds and casting long shadows across the room. It was late, far later than she usually stayed up, but tonight was different. The silence in her apartment felt heavier, thicker. It seemed to press against her chest, suffocating her as she tried to distract herself with her phone. But there was something unsettling that had been lingering in the air all evening. The first time she'd noticed the strange occurrence, she brushed it off as fatigue. After all, she'd been working long hours at the office lately, and stress was known to play tricks on the mind. But tonight, the voices returned. They had started a few nights ago. At first, they were faint, barely audible, like whispers carried by the wind. Lena had been too tired to truly focus on them, dismissing them as a figment of her imagination. But tonight, the voices were clearer, louder, and they weren't whispers anymore. She held her breath, straining her ears. A voice, clear and distinct, echoed from somewhere deep within the walls of her apartment. She couldn't tell if it was real or if it was just the house settling. But then another voice joined in. This time it was sharper, more urgent. The words were familiar, but they didn't make sense. "Help me. It's too late." Lena froze, heart pounding in her chest. She was certain she hadn't imagined it this time. The voices were too real, too vivid. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, bouncing off the walls, echoing through the empty space. She jumped up, the cold floor against her bare feet sending a shiver up her spine. The apartment was supposed to be quiet, peaceful, a sanctuary from the outside world. She had moved here only a few months ago, a fresh start after a painful breakup. But now it felt wrong. Lena stepped into the hallway, her breath visible in the cool air, though the heating had been running for hours. The voices echoed again, this time clearer than before, pulling her toward the living room. It was a mix of voices, some indistinct, others chillingly sharp. Yet they all had one thing in common. They spoke of something terrible, of something from the past. "Why didn't you stop it?" Lena shivered. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She had no idea what they meant, but somehow they felt deeply personal, like they were meant for her and her alone. With trepidation, she made her way to the living room, where the voices grew louder. The walls, once painted in a soft beige, now seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, as if they had absorbed something dark over the years. She ran her fingers along the back of the couch, her knuckles cold against the fabric. She needed to do something. She couldn't just stand there and listen to these voices, to these echoes. The whispers intensified, now forming sentences that twisted her gut. "You were there. You saw it all." Lena's heart skipped a beat. She had never seen anything. Not anything like what these voices were describing. What could they be talking about? Her mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. She had never been part of any tragedy. Nothing that would explain this. But the more she listened, the more the voices seemed to know her, to know everything about her. "Lena, why didn't you stop it?" The question repeated, louder now, like a drumbeat in her mind. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in on her, pressing her toward the truth she couldn't remember. Her knees felt weak, and she sank down onto the floor, clutching her head as if to keep her mind from shattering under the weight of the voices. "Help me. It's too late. It's already happening." And then there was silence. For a long, eerie moment, the apartment was still. Lena couldn't tell if she was relieved or terrified. She opened her eyes, realizing that her fingers had been digging into the carpet, her body trembling from the intense sensation of the voices. She rose unsteadily to her feet, heart still pounding, sweat beading on her forehead. The room was now unnervingly quiet. The shadows seemed to loom larger, stretching across the walls like dark, sinister fingers. Was it her mind playing tricks on her again? Or was this something more? Lena's breath caught in her throat as she turned toward the hallway. At the far end of the narrow corridor, she saw it. A door she had never noticed before. It stood ajar, just enough to beckon her. The faintest glow seemed to seep from beneath the crack, light where there should have been none. Her heart pounded in her chest, but something deep inside told her she needed to go to that door. The voices had led her this far, hadn't they? And now they were silent, waiting, watching. The door seemed to call her. With trembling hands, Lena stepped forward. The closer she got, the louder her heartbeat became. She felt as though the walls themselves were watching her, breathing with her, waiting for her to make the choice. She stood before the door, her fingers brushing the cold brass doorknob. The whispering started again, this time louder than ever. Open it. Her pulse raced, her mind screaming for her to turn and run. But she didn't. She couldn't. The door had to be opened. She turned the knob, and in that moment, everything changed. The door swung open with a creak, revealing an old, dusty room that looked nothing like the rest of the apartment. It was dark, far too dark for a place that had been sealed shut for years. And then, amidst the darkness, something glimmered, something faint, almost too faint to see. It looked like a photograph she didn't recognize. Lena reached out, her hand trembling as it hovered over the photograph. But before she could touch it, a voice, cold and clear, rang out behind her. You weren't supposed to see this. Lena's breath came in short, ragged gasps as she stared into the darkened room. The door that had just opened creaked behind her, as though it had never been touched. She could feel the presence of something unseen in the air, an oppressive weight, like the very atmosphere was charged with energy. The photograph, now resting just inches away from her trembling hand, seemed to pulse with an otherworldly glow. You weren't supposed to see this. The words still echoed in her mind, but there was no sign of anyone. No voice, no movement, just the thick silence pressing in on her. Lena's heart thudded painfully against her chest as her fingers hovered over the photo, hesitant to touch it, to disturb what was clearly a relic of some forgotten past. The longer she stood there, the more uneasy she felt. Her instincts screamed at her to leave, to close the door and forget everything. But a part of her, something deep inside, pulled her closer. She needed to understand. She needed to know what this was. Taking a deep breath, she finally allowed her fingers to graze the edge of the photograph. The paper was old, crisp and brittle, yet it felt impossibly cold to the touch. Slowly, she lifted it from its resting place and brought it into the dim light. Her breath caught in her throat. The image that stared back at her was unfamiliar, but it felt familiar, as though it were a memory she had long forgotten, a memory that belonged to someone else. A group of people, strangers yet somehow so recognizable, stood frozen in time. They were dressed in old-fashioned clothing, their faces pale and somber. Lena could feel their eyes on her even in the photograph. There was something about the way they stared that sent a chill down her spine. And then, as if the room itself had responded to her thoughts, the air around her grew colder, the shadows darkening as if they were drawing closer. She tried to push away the feeling of dread creeping up her spine, but it was impossible. Her mind raced. Who were these people? Why did she feel like she knew them? More importantly, how was it possible for her to have found this photograph in her apartment, a place she had only recently moved into? Why didn't you stop it? The voice returned, clearer now, almost as if it was inside her head. Lena spun around, the photograph still clutched in her hand, but there was no one. The room was empty, just as it had been before, but the silence seemed to stretch, to grow thick, as though it were suffocating her. In the flickering shadows of the room, something caught her eye, a faint outline against the wall, barely visible but unmistakable. A figure standing still, watching her. She froze. The figure was just beyond the edges of the room, a shadow amongst shadows. It was almost as if it didn't belong to this world, a distortion in the fabric of reality itself. She could feel its presence, its weight, pressing down on her like a vice. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her body refused to move. The figure was somehow familiar, but its features were blurred, obscured by the darkness. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. The room was empty again. Just the faint sound of her breathing and the rustling of the photograph in her trembling hand. Lena stumbled backward, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. What had she just seen? What was happening? Her body screamed for her to escape, but her feet felt like they were glued to the floor. Her gaze drifted to the photograph again. The people in the image, those haunting, familiar faces, they were still staring back at her, their eyes impossibly wide, as if they were trying to warn her. Lena couldn't explain it, but something about this photograph, this room, the voices, something was pulling her in. The connection was undeniable. She had to understand. She had to find out what it all meant. But just as she moved to leave the room, the voices returned, this time louder and more frantic. "You don't know what you've done." The walls around her seemed to pulse, the room shrinking in on her as the voices grew more desperate, more forceful. Lena stumbled toward the door, her hand reaching out for the knob, but it was as if the door itself had become part of the darkness. Her fingers brushed against it, but it wouldn't open. Panic surged within her, and she pulled at the door, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely a sound in the thick silence. "Please, let me out." But no matter how hard she pulled, the door wouldn't budge. She turned back to the room, the photograph now burning a hole in her hand. The people in the picture, they were closer now. Their faces were no longer just blurred shapes. They were staring directly at her, their mouths open in silent screams. "You shouldn't have come here," the voice echoed, a cold whisper that made her blood run cold. Lena's legs buckled beneath her, and she collapsed to the floor. The photograph fell from her hand, landing face down. She couldn't look at it anymore. The figure, the voices, the sense of foreboding. It was all too much. But as she sat there, staring at the empty floor, she felt something shift in the air. The temperature dropped further, and a faint, unsettling sound reached her ears. A low, guttural noise, like the wind, but heavier, more deliberate. Slowly, almost unwillingly, Lena's eyes turned to the photograph on the ground. And as she stared at it, a realization hit her like a punch to the gut. The figures in the photograph, they weren't just staring at her. They were reaching out, their hands stretching toward her, as if trying to pull her into the photograph, into their world. Lena tried to scream, but the sound died in her throat. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. All she could do was stare at the photograph, her mind unraveling as she felt herself being drawn toward it. And then, everything went black. Lena's eyes snapped open, and the first thing she noticed was the cold. It wrapped around her like a thick, suffocating blanket, the kind that made her skin crawl and her bones ache. She struggled to sit up, her vision blurry and her head pounding. It took a few moments for her to realize that she wasn't in her apartment anymore. The room around her was dark, save for the faint light filtering through what looked like a cracked window. A draft blew through the gaps, carrying with it an odd smell, musty, like old books and dust. mixed with something far less pleasant. The walls, once clean and neat, now looked aged and cracked, as if time had forgotten this place. Lena rubbed her temples, trying to gather her thoughts. She tried to remember how she got here, but the last thing she recalled was the photograph. She had been holding it, feeling its icy touch, when everything went black. Her heart raced as she struggled to stand. She glanced around, the room spinning in a haze. It was small, the kind of room that felt cramped even when empty. The floor beneath her feet creaked with every step she took, and her footsteps echoed unnervingly in the silence. There was a door in front of her, half open, the faintest sliver of light seeping through the crack. She moved toward it, her body still trembling from the cold. But as she got closer, she noticed something strange. The light from the door, it wasn't warm, like the light from a normal room. It was cold, distant, as if it were coming from a place far away. Place that wasn't here. Lena reached out to touch the door, but as soon as her fingers brushed the handle, the air around her shifted. The temperature dropped even further, and the shadows seemed to grow longer, stretching across the walls like dark, sinister fingers. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and her breath came out in quick, shallow gasps. And then the whispers began. They were soft at first, just a faint murmur, like the wind, but they grew louder, more distinct, until Lena could hear them clearly, echoing in her ears. It was like the voices were coming from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. She couldn't make out the words, but she could feel the urgency in their tone, the desperation. Her heart began to pound harder in her chest. The whispers were closing in on her, surrounding her, pressing against her mind. Lena's eyes darted around the room. The shadows in the corners seemed to twitch, as though something or someone was hiding there. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself, but it was no use. The atmosphere was thick with tension, heavy and suffocating. She needed to get out of here. With shaking hands, she twisted the handle and pushed the door open. The hinges screamed in protest, as if warning her to turn back. But Lena couldn't. She couldn't stay here with the whispers and the shadows. She stepped into the hallway, hoping that the fresh air would clear her head. But the hallway stretched before her, impossibly long, just like the photograph. The walls were lined with pictures, old, yellowed photographs of people she didn't recognize. Their eyes seemed to follow her as she moved down the corridor, 1,000 silent witnesses to whatever was happening here. The whispering voices were louder now, echoing off the walls, and Lena felt her sanity beginning to fray at the edges. She could hear them more clearly now. They weren't just whispers anymore. They were words, desperate words pleading for help. Don't listen. You'll become part of it. Stop before it's too late. Run. Run while you still can. Lena's breath hitched in her throat, and she quickened her pace. The more she walked, the more the whispers seemed to grow, like a chorus of voices calling out to her from all directions. The hairs on the back of her neck prickled, and her feet seemed to move of their own accord, drawing her deeper into the house. The farther she went, the colder it became. The shadows stretched longer, and the pictures on the walls seemed to warp and change, their faces flickering, as if they were alive. Lena's pulse raced. This was no ordinary house. It wasn't even a house at all. It was something else, something twisted, something wrong. She could feel it in her bones. The end of the hallway was just ahead, and as she reached it, she found herself standing before another door. This one was different from the others. It was ancient, with dark wood and a brass handle that gleamed in the dim light. There was something about it that made her stomach turn, a sense of finality, like this door led to something she couldn't escape from. But the voices, the whispers, were too much. They were deafening now, and she couldn't ignore them any longer. She reached out and turned the handle. The door creaked open, and as it did, the temperature dropped even further. Lena felt a shiver run down her spine as she stepped inside. This room was larger than the others, but it was just as cold. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper, the edges peeling away like the remnants of a forgotten memory. In the center of the room stood a large, antique mirror. Its frame was ornate, dark and twisted, with intricate designs that seemed to move as if they had a life of their own. Lena took a step closer, her heart thudding in her chest. She couldn't explain why, but she felt drawn to the mirror, as if it was calling her. She reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the glass. The coldness of it sent a shock through her, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw something shift in the reflection. A figure standing just behind her. She spun around, but the room was empty. There was no one there. Her breath caught in her throat, and she slowly turned back to the mirror. And then she saw it. In the reflection, there were people. The same faces from the photograph, the same people she had seen in the hallway. They were standing behind her, their eyes wide and filled with a silent, desperate plea. "Why didn't you listen?" One of them whispered, their voice low and hollow. "Now it's too late." Lena's heart raced, her blood running cold as she backed away from the mirror. But as she did, the reflection didn't change. The people stayed there, staring at her, their faces twisted with sorrow and fear. And then, with a sickening jolt, the glass rippled. The figure in the reflection stepped forward, out of the mirror, and into the room with her. Lena screamed as the world around her went dark. Lena's heart hammered in her chest, each beat louder than the last, echoing in her skull. She couldn't breathe. The air had thickened, pressing against her lungs, squeezing the life out of her with every inhale. She stumbled back, her legs like jelly beneath her, as the figure, no, the thing, stepped further into the room. Its features were blurred, out of focus, as if it were a shadow trying to take form. Yet, Lena could feel its presence, cold, oppressive, suffocating. It had no eyes, no face, just a dark void that seemed to devour the light around it. But she knew it was watching her. She could feel it in every fiber of her being, like an invisible hand tightening around her throat, pulling her in closer, inch by inch. The whispers were back, louder now, their words more frantic, their urgency growing by the second. "Don't look away. Run, before it's too late." The walls seemed to close in on her. The room stretched, the corners darkening, the mirror warping as though it were alive, breathing, pulsating. Lena's pulse quickened, her breath shallow and uneven. She took a step back, only to trip over something cold and hard on the floor. She fell backward, her hands scraping against the rough wood, and looked up to find herself face to face with the figure. It was closer now, impossibly so, its presence pressing against her chest, its form shifting like smoke in the air. The temperature had dropped to the point where she could see her breath fogging in front of her. It felt as if she were standing in the heart of winter, the frost settling on her skin, crawling beneath her clothes. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling, barely audible above the roar of the whispers. "I can't." But it was too late. The figure extended its arm, no, its limb, toward her, long and unnatural, its fingers stretching impossibly far, ending in sharp, claw-like nails that gleamed in the dim light. Lena gasped, her body frozen in terror, but her instincts kicked in, and she scrambled backward, her feet slipping on the slick floor. It wasn't a choice anymore. She had to get away. She had to escape this nightmare before it consumed her, before the past swallowed her whole. But as she tried to move, the room shifted. The walls warped and groaned, the floor buckling beneath her feet. The mirror, still reflecting her trembling form, rippled like water disturbed by a stone, distorting her reflection until she barely recognized herself. And then, with a deafening crack, the air seemed to freeze. Lena looked up, her breath caught in her throat. Behind the figure, the shadows parted, revealing something that made her stomach lurch. There, standing in the doorway, was a face. It was a woman's face, pale with hollow eyes that seemed to look straight through her, unblinking and unfeeling. The woman's lips were cracked, as if they had been sewn shut, and her skin was mottled, as though it had been touched by time itself. The woman stepped forward, her movement jerky, unnatural. Lena felt an overwhelming sense of dread settle over her like a blanket. She had seen this face before, the woman from the photograph, the one with the haunting eyes that followed her every move. She had to know what was happening. Why were these people trapped here? Why was this room pulling her into its depths? But as the woman moved closer, Lena felt something shift in the air, something thick and heavy, like the weight of 1,000 forgotten memories pressing against her. She could feel it, the presence of something ancient, something long buried, stirring to life. The whispers grew louder, the voices pleading with her now, desperate for her attention, for her to understand. It's not just the house, one of them hissed. It's the past, the echoes. They're alive. Lena's head spun, her vision blurred. The room tilted, as though she were standing on the edge of a cliff, the ground beneath her feet crumbling away. She reached out to steady herself, but the floor shifted again, and she fell to her knees. The woman was standing right in front of her now, her eyes empty and cold, her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile that sent a wave of nausea through Lena's body. The figure, the shadow, still loomed behind her, its claws reaching out inches from her skin. Lena could feel her body growing weaker, the coldness seeping into her bones. Her vision narrowed, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She could hear the voices now, loud and shrill, clawing at her mind. "You're part of it now," they whispered, their voices a chorus of agony. "There's no turning back." The woman's hand reached down toward Lena, and the chill of it made her blood run cold. "Why?" Lena whispered, her voice barely a breath, more a plea than a question. "Why are you doing this?" The woman's lips parted, but the words that came from her mouth were not her own. They were something older, something far darker, resonating deep in Lena's chest, as if the house itself were speaking through her. "Because you listened," the voice said, its tone cruel and ancient. "You're here because you couldn't ignore the past, and now you'll never leave." Lena tried to pull away, but her limbs felt like lead. Her body was betraying her, as if the very air was stealing her strength, draining her of everything that made her human. The shadows closed in, and the figure in the corner moved, its presence a cold, suffocating weight. The whispers turned into screams, their voices becoming a deafening roar, filling every inch of the room. Lena could hear the faces, the people, the echoes from the past, all of them screaming for release, for freedom, for their torment to end. But there was no escape. The woman's hand was inches from Lena's face, her touch freezing. And just as her fingers brushed against Lena's skin, the room exploded in a burst of blinding light. And then, nothing. The blinding light that had consumed Lena's body slowly faded, retreating into the shadows like the last remnants of a bad dream. But she wasn't in the room anymore. She wasn't even sure where she was. Lena's eyes fluttered open, and she gasped for breath, her chest heaving. The air felt thick, as if something was weighing down on her very soul. Her vision was blurry, her senses disoriented, and for a moment, she thought she was back in the house where it all began. But as her eyes adjusted, she realized she wasn't. She was in a vast, empty space. The surroundings were dim and featureless, like a place that existed between time and memory. There was no ceiling, no walls, no floor, just an endless void that stretched into infinity. The air smelled of dust and something older, like forgotten rooms left untouched for years. There was no sound, only silence so deep and complete that it seemed to swallow her thoughts. Lena stood up, her legs shaking beneath her. The last thing she remembered was falling to her knees in front of the woman, her fingers brushing against the cold skin, and then nothing. She rubbed her eyes, trying to make sense of it all. Where had the woman gone? Where was the figure in the corner? What had happened to the house? She took a tentative step forward, then another and another, her feet making no sound against the invisible ground. She wasn't sure why she kept moving. There was no destination, no reason to go anywhere, but something pulled her, urging her to keep going, to find something, anything. And then, just as she was beginning to question whether this was real, a sound pierced the stillness. It was faint at first, barely a whisper, but then it grew louder, clearer. The voices, the same voices she had heard before, the ones in the house. But this time, they weren't just whispers. They were words. "Lena, come closer." She froze, her heart leaping into her throat. The voice, no voices, called to her, drawing her toward a point in the distance. There, in the middle of the void, a figure materialized. It was a woman, tall, pale, and familiar. Lena's breath caught in her throat as the woman's form became more solid, more real. It was the woman from the photograph, the same one who had haunted her in the house. But this time, she was different. Her skin was smooth, unblemished, and her eyes, those empty, hollow eyes, looked directly at Lena. "You've come," the woman said, her voice low and haunting. "I've been waiting for you." Lena took a step back, her mind racing. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be real. She had to be dreaming, or maybe she was dead. Maybe everything had been a nightmare, a twisted illusion. But as the woman stepped forward, Lena's stomach churned with a feeling she couldn't explain. "Where am I?" Lena whispered, her voice trembling. The woman smiled, a slow, unsettling smile that made Lena's skin crawl. "You are in the place between memories, the place where things lost to time come to rest." Lena shook her head, struggling to understand. I don't understand. What is this place? What do you want from me?" The woman's smile faded, replaced by a cold, empty stare. "I want nothing from you. I only want to show you the truth." Lena's pulse quickened. "The truth?" The woman nodded. "The truth of why you are here. The truth of the house. The truth of the voices that call to you." Lena took a step back. "I don't want to know. I just want to wake up." The woman's lips parted, but no sound came out. Instead, the void around them seemed to shift, as if the very fabric of reality was warping. The ground beneath Lena's feet began to ripple, the air growing colder with every passing second. "Wake up," the woman echoed, her voice distorted, as if the words themselves were being torn apart. "You're already awake, Lena. You've always been awake. The past never lets go." Lena's legs buckled beneath her, and she fell to her knees. The woman's words echoed in her mind, reverberating like a drumbeat, relentless and unforgiving. The walls of reality were collapsing around her, and she couldn't escape. "Please," Lena gasped, tears streaming down her face. "I don't want to be a part of this. I just want to go home. Please let me go." But the woman's expression remained unchanged. She didn't show mercy. She didn't show emotion. She only stared at Lena with those hollow eyes, as if she were already dead. "The past is never finished," the woman said, her voice like ice. And neither are you. You've come too far. You've heard the echoes, and now you will be one of them." The words hit Lena like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of her. She wanted to scream, to fight back, but her body wouldn't respond. She was frozen in place, unable to move or speak. The woman's figure began to fade, retreating into the darkness as if it were a part of it, until only the whispering voices remained. "No," Lena whispered weakly, her voice barely audible. "No." The voices began to surround her, their words growing louder, more frantic. "Lena, listen. You have to listen." She clutched her head, the noise overwhelming, the voices becoming a cacophony of pain, sorrow, and rage. They filled her mind, drowning out everything else. They were inside her head, inside her thoughts. And then, just as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. Lena looked up, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The void was silent once again, but the silence was worse than the noise. It was suffocating. It was empty. A figure appeared in front of her, a shadow in the shape of a person, tall and imposing. It stepped closer, and Lena could feel its presence, cold and suffocating. Its eyes, no, its gaze was fixed on her, pulling her in. She couldn't look away. She didn't want to, but she knew, deep down, that she couldn't escape this. She had already been swallowed whole by the past, and now the price was due. Lena felt herself being drawn into the darkness. The cold air rushed around her, the darkness pressing against her body like an invisible force, suffocating and relentless. She struggled to breathe, her chest tightening with every passing moment. She couldn't see anything, couldn't hear anything, but the cold presence still lingered, wrapping around her, threatening to pull her deeper into the void. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the darkness receded. Lena opened her eyes, and the world around her snapped back into focus. She was standing in the middle of the living room again, the same place where it had all begun, the house. But it was different now. The air felt heavier, and there was a chilling stillness in the atmosphere. The familiar warmth of the home was gone, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to weigh down on her very soul. Lena's breath caught in her throat. She looked around, hoping to find something, anything, that would explain what had happened. But the house was empty. The rooms were barren, the furniture stripped away. The wallpaper was peeling, and the windows were cracked, as if the house had been abandoned for years. As she stepped forward, a strange sound echoed in the distance. An old, creaking door. Her heart raced, her instincts screaming at her to leave, to run. But she couldn't move. She couldn't tear herself away from the house, from the place where the voices had first begun. The sound of the door creaking grew louder, and then a figure appeared at the far end of the hall. It was a man, his face hidden in shadow, his posture stiff and unnatural. He didn't move, didn't speak, but his presence filled the room like a heavy fog. Lena's breath quickened, and she took a step back. "Who are you?" she whispered, but the words barely escaped her lips. The figure didn't answer. Instead, he took a step forward, his movements jerky and unnatural, as if he were being controlled by some unseen force. His steps echoed in the silent house, each one sending a wave of dread through Lena's body. The closer he got, the more Lena felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over her. This wasn't just a person. Couldn't be. There was something wrong, something deeply unnatural about him. "Who are you?" Lena repeated, louder this time, her voice shaking. "What do you want from me?" The figure stopped in front of her, his face still hidden in shadow. His lips curled into a grin, an eerie, twisted smile that made Lena's blood run cold. The air grew colder still, and Lena felt her body freeze in place. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body refused to obey. "Don't you remember?" The figure's voice was low, almost a whisper, but it sent shivers down Lena's spine. "You've always known who I am." Lena felt a chill crawl up her spine. She wanted to look away, but the figure's gaze seemed to hold her in place, forcing her to meet his eyes. And then, a realization hit her. A memory she had long buried in the deepest corners of her mind. A memory that had come back to haunt her, just like the voices. The figure wasn't a stranger. He was someone she knew, someone from her past, a memory long forgotten, a part of her life she had tried so hard to escape. The man stepped forward, his hand reaching out toward her. Lena stumbled backward, her heart racing as she realized the truth. "No," she gasped, her voice barely a whisper. "It can't be." But the man didn't stop. He was close now, so close she could feel the chill of his presence, the coldness radiating from his skin. He reached out, his fingers brushing against Lena's cheek. The touch sent a shockwave through her, like ice seeping into her bones. Her vision blurred, and the room around her seemed to spin. She tried to pull away, but it was like her body was no longer hers to control. "You can't escape the past, Lena," the figure said, his voice like a serpent's hiss. "It will always find you." Lena screamed, a primal, guttural sound that echoed through the empty house. But it didn't matter. No one could hear her. She was trapped, trapped in the house, trapped in the past. And then, just as suddenly as it had all begun, the figure disappeared. The coldness, the silence, it all vanished. Lena was alone again, but she knew this wasn't over. The past wasn't done with her yet. It had never been finished. And as the house stood silently around her, Lena realized the truth. She was part of the story now, part of the echo that would never fade. The price of memory had been paid, and there was no turning back. Lena's heart pounded as the whispers surrounded her, growing louder, more insistent. The voices that had once been distant now filled her ears, sharp and clear. They spoke of secrets buried deep in the recesses of her memory, secrets she'd longed to forget. But the truth couldn't be buried. Not anymore. The faces swirled around her, flickering in and out of existence like ghosts trapped in time. They weren't just figments of her imagination. They were people she had known, faces from her past, her family, friends, and strangers from long-forgotten memories. Each face carried a story, a connection, a moment in time when their lives had intersected with hers. Lena reached out, trembling, trying to grasp the faces, but they slipped through her fingers like smoke, fading into nothingness. She stumbled back, her mind racing. She couldn't make sense of it all. She couldn't understand why these faces were tormenting her, why they seemed to be calling her back to a past she'd tried so hard to escape. Suddenly, a loud crash broke through the chaos of the whispers, jolting Lena from her trance. She spun around, her pulse racing, only to find herself standing in front of a cracked mirror, one she didn't recognize. The reflection staring back at her was a distorted version of herself, her face twisted in horror. Her eyes were wide with fear, her lips trembling as though she were about to scream, but no sound escaped her mouth. And then the reflection in the mirror spoke. "It's too late, Lena," it whispered, its voice cold and eerie, just like the voice of the man she had encountered earlier. "You can't run from what you've done. You can't escape the past." Lena's breath caught in her throat. She took a step back, her mind reeling. She couldn't understand what was happening. The mirror wasn't just reflecting her image. It was showing her something else, something darker. The reflection grinned at her, a twisted, malevolent smile that sent a chill down Lena's spine. "You should have listened to the voices," it said, its lips curling with malicious delight. You should have let them guide you. Now you're trapped." Lena recoiled, her legs weak as she stumbled away from the mirror. She tried to shake off the feeling of being watched, but the voices in her head only grew louder. The faces continued to materialize around her, each one more desperate, more frantic, as though they were trying to tell her something. But what? Lena's mind was clouded with confusion, her thoughts spiraling. She had to get out of the house. She had to find a way to escape this nightmare. But as she turned toward the door, she saw something that froze her in her tracks. The door was gone. Where the wooden door had stood moments before, there was now nothing but solid wall. The house had shifted again, its very structure bending and warping as if it were alive. The walls seemed to pulse with a dark energy, and Lena felt herself being pulled deeper into the house, into the past she had tried so desperately to forget. She screamed, her voice echoing through the empty halls, but there was no one to hear her. The walls swallowed her cries, leaving her alone with the relentless, suffocating presence of the house. Then, a new voice broke through the chaos, a voice she recognized. Lena, it was her mother's voice, soft and gentle, calling her name from somewhere deep within the house. But it wasn't a comforting sound. It was a warning, a lure. Lena's heart skipped a beat. Her mother had died years ago, yet here she was, calling her from the shadows. She knew it was a trick, a cruel game played by the house, by whatever dark force had taken hold of her. But despite the fear gnawing at her insides, Lena found herself walking toward the sound of her mother's voice. She didn't know why. She didn't know what had come over her. But something inside her urged her forward, pulling her deeper into the house, deeper into the echoes of the past. As she moved through the halls, the walls seemed to close in around her, the air thick with a sense of foreboding. She could feel the temperature drop, a bone-chilling cold seeping into her skin. The voices had stopped, but the silence was almost worse, deafening and oppressive. And then she saw it. At the end of the hallway stood a figure, its back turned to her. The figure was tall, cloaked in shadow, but there was no mistaking who it was. It was her mother. Lena could see the familiar outline of her figure, the way she stood, the way she held herself. Lena's heart raced. She wanted to run, but her legs wouldn't obey her. She was frozen in place, her eyes locked onto the figure ahead. She had to reach her. She had to know what was happening. But as she stepped closer, the figure turned around, and Lena's blood ran cold. It wasn't her mother. The face staring back at her was twisted, distorted, a grotesque mockery of the woman she had once known. The eyes were black voids, empty and soulless, and the mouth twisted into a cruel, mocking smile. The figure was no longer human. It was something else, something ancient, something that had been waiting for Lena to return. "You shouldn't have come back," the figure whispered, its voice a distorted echo of her mother's. "Now there's no escape." Lena's heart thundered in her chest as the grotesque figure reached for her, its black, hollow eyes locked onto hers with a terrifying intensity. She tried to scream, but her voice was lost, choked by the heavy air that seemed to suffocate her very soul. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but her feet were glued to the floor, unwilling to move. The figure's hands stretched closer, fingers twisted like gnarled branches, and as it reached for her, the world around Lena began to shift. The walls of the house seemed to ripple like water, distorting in waves as though the very fabric of reality was bending to some unseen force. The whispers, those maddening echoes that had tormented her, grew louder, a cacophony of voices overlapping in her mind, drowning out everything else. Lena's mind reeled. The house was alive, alive with the memories of those who had been trapped here before her. The voices she had heard, the faces she had seen in the mirrors, They weren't just echoes of the past. They were the souls of those who had perished in this house, their fates sealed by the dark entity that had consumed them. But what did it want with her? Suddenly, a memory flashed in her mind, a fragment from her past that she had long buried deep within herself. Her mother's face, her warm smile, the words she had whispered to Lena in the quiet moments of their lives. Words that Lena had forgotten until now. Her mother had warned her about this place, about the darkness that lay within its walls. She had known that Lena's curiosity would lead her here. She had known that the house would call to her, just as it had called to so many before. "You shouldn't have come back," the twisted figure hissed, its voice echoing the same warning her mother had once given. "You wanted to know the truth. Now you'll never escape." Lena's body trembled with fear, but somewhere deep within her, a surge of anger sparked. She wasn't going to let this thing that had taken so much from her, win. She wasn't going to be another soul trapped within these walls, doomed to wander for eternity in the endless echo of the past. With every ounce of strength she had left, Lena tore herself away from the figure's outstretched hand. She stumbled backward, her legs unsteady, but she refused to stop. She had to get out. She had to break free. The house roared in response, the walls shaking as though it were alive with rage. The faces of the lost souls twisted in the mirrors, their silent screams filling the air. The very ground beneath her feet seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy, threatening to drag her into the abyss. But Lena kept moving, her heart pounding with a desperation she had never known. She had to find a way out, to break the cycle before it consumed her, before she became another echo in the house's dark history. And then she saw it. At the end of the hallway, where the walls seemed to warp and bend, there was a door she hadn't noticed before. It wasn't like the others. It was old, weathered, and covered in strange symbols that seemed to shift before her eyes. She knew without a doubt that this was the way out, but it wouldn't be easy. The figure, the twisted reflection of her mother, let out a low, guttural laugh. "You can't escape, Lena. The house has already claimed you." Lena's breath hitched. The door was her only hope, and she knew that if she didn't make it through, she would be lost forever. She rushed toward it, her pulse racing, her hands trembling as she reached for the handle. The air around her thickened, the whispers growing louder, pushing against her mind, trying to drag her back into the darkness. But Lena didn't stop. She couldn't. With a final surge of willpower, she turned the handle and flung the door open. The world around her seemed to twist and fracture, the walls and floors warping as she stepped through. She felt herself falling into a void of darkness, but she didn't know if it was the house pulling her in or if she was finally escaping its grip. The voices screamed, the faces vanished, and the darkness closed in around her. Then, everything went silent. Lena blinked, her eyes adjusting to the light. She was no longer in the house. She was outside, standing in the middle of a snow-covered forest, the cold biting at her skin. The world was eerily still, the only sound the whisper of the wind as it howled through the trees. The snowstorm had stopped. She was free, or so she thought. Lena looked around, disoriented. The forest was unfamiliar, and as she tried to make sense of her surroundings, she noticed something strange. The snow, once pristine and untouched, now seemed to be disturbed. Footprints, deep and heavy, led through the snow, disappearing into the distance. She followed them, her heart heavy with a sense of foreboding. And then she saw it, a figure standing alone in the distance, staring at her. The same twisted figure she had seen in the house. The same black eyes, the same cruel smile. Lena froze, her blood turning to ice. The house hadn't let her go. It had just followed her, and now there was nowhere left to hide.